Shirley Augusta Albert Pierce. October, Halloween, 1933, I was born at in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota Hospitals. Family, grandpa, grandma, aunts, uncles, cousins, all were in Little Falls and Royalton. So every weekend we drove with my little sister, mom and dad, to Royalton for the weekend. And as we came through Champlin and over the bridge to Anoka, I'd say, there it is, to my little sister. There's my castle, there's my castle. So in the tornado in 1939, and my parents called attention to the destroyed homes and the trees down, and as we approached Anoka, I thought, the castle's still there. And then in 1952, just before I graduated from high school, 1951, I met Paul Pierce Jr. in Elk River. And in addition to being a lovely person, his dad owned my castle. So we were married, and our son Paul III was born and raised in the castle. Along with the castle were 3 motel units, because motels had become the way to travel. As history recorded through the friends I met and had been patients here, the Kline Sanitarium was built by Dr. Kline. It's a functioning building, and it's beautifully built. Everything in here is just built to last, and lath and plaster, just a very solid construction. The first two floors were first, and the 3rd floor was built later, so it's not as elaborate. The ceilings are not quite as high, but there's such a feeling of majesty in here because of the height of the ceilings and the heaviness of the woodwork. It's a fabulous building, and thank goodness hasn't been rubbled, which we tend to do now. Dr. Kline had a variety of interests. One of them was holistic medicine, so he had left in the basement here boxes that he sold of nutmeg with the grinders and every kind of spice. And I have a sample of each one in Florida where I live now. But as a young bride in 1952, everything was open, nothing was locked up. So in the wide doors into the basement were specimens. There were preemie babies, there were fingers and toes, there were tapeworms. There was a room that must have been a laboratory study room or something in the basement that had all these shelves with specimens that my husband's grandpa cleaned out, much to my father-in-law's horror. Everything was thrown down and back in a pit and destroyed before Paul Sr. discovered that they were gone. And so the memory is in my vision, and my former husband's, not even in my son's, because he was a little boy at that time. I asked him one time if Grandpa ever got angry with him, because we all lived here on this property. And he said, oh yeah, my buddy and I were breaking light bulbs down on his driveway, and so with stones. So, and he used to he would dig pits with his buddy down by the river and then jump his mini bike over it, and Grandpa said, cover those up. I think he was always conscious that the public might sue him for something. In fact, he asked Butch when he was in college, because he knew that my husband was not interested. My husband was interested in opera and theater, and he knew that this building wasn't what I loved and Grandpa loved, but Butch does love. And so that's how Butch has followed through with the legacy of the Pierce at the Kline. And so, but he has some stories that he collected that I'm not aware of, which makes it fun, because he and Grandpa were together And Grandpa Pierce, because Second World War was engaged and there were not parts, and Paul Sr. was so handy. Butch's turned out to be the same as Grandpa. So he would create parts if your refrigerator didn't work. One of the most memorable days to me was very early living here in 1952. Is our wedding reception was planned here. In those years, receptions were in the evening, and you had a tiered wedding cake, but you also had formed ice cream in doves and flowers and so forth, and pretty little tea sandwiches and punches. It was strictly a reception. It was not, a meal or anything. And there were many, many people, and being a large area and the porch a large area and a very warm night, June 7th, there were people everywhere, and even my husband's grandma, who was 100, never came to anything, Grandma Norris. She even came, and I, of course, had to meet new people, and being very young, that wasn't easy. Well, back in the 1940s, I liked yard work. So this old man from the third floor, Mr. Rosenau, would come down and tell me how to do things. And now I would appreciate it, but then I didn't. And I would get thorns from the rose. Everything was lined with rose bushes. Dr. Kline had gardeners, and he had the first automobile in town. He had a livery stable with all of his horses and so forth. But Mr. Rosenau had been dropped here in the early 40s, right after the Pierces opened up, by a wife who said, "If anything happens, call me." Now this is at least 10, 15 years later, and he was always at lunch down on the corner, and all of a sudden we got a call asking if we had seen him. He had come in and confused the downstairs for the upstairs where he lived, and he was dead in the basement. And he had a daughter, and a grown daughter and a wife, and so they took care of handling everything there. That was the first death in my experience, and of course I happened to be in my castle. And I'm thrilled that Paul III loves it, that Butch loves it as I do. And when Butch was born, I was at Maternity Hospital, which was a private hospital of Dr. Philip Gordon and Dr. Evers Shaperman in North Minneapolis. It is long since gone. It was built as a refuge for unwed mothers. So many of the employees were very pregnant young ladies who were going to have their babies there and then decide what that child's future would be. So I knew I wanted Paul III, but now we had Paul Sr. and Paul Jr., and mother-in-law Dolores said, "You can't name him Paul. We already have too many. When he's teenage, they're going to say, 'Which Paul? Which Paul?'" So I pondered and pondered and had to pay a penalty to the state for waiting so long to name him, and guess what? I won. So he's Paul III, which Grandma loved, but she tagged him with Butch, and I didn't like Butch, but it stuck. He likes it. So that when you ask for Butch, that's who you get.